God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. Bucer stood forward, and with an adjuration similar to that which Farel had formerly employed to constrain him to abide in Geneva, he constrained Calvin to return to it. Bucer bade him be aware of the punishment of Jonas for refusing to go and preach repentance to the Ninevites. This was enough. The die was cast. Mobs might rage, faction might plot, 100 deaths might await him in Geneva. He would go nevertheless, since duty called him. He now began to prepare his journey. Loaded with many marks of honor by the magistrates of Strasbourg, he bade adieu to that city. A mounted herald sent from Geneva rode before him. He traveled slowly, halting at Neuchâtel to compose some differences which had sprung up in the flock of Farel, and solace himself a little while in the society of the most loved of all his friends, before crossing the territory of the Vaud and resuming his great task. On the 13th of September we behold him entering the gates of Geneva, his face still pale, but lighted up with his earnest look and eagle eye. He climbs amid the reverent gaze of the citizens, the steep and narrow Rue des Chenons, and takes up his abode in a house prepared for him beforehand at the head of that street, with its little garden behind, and a glorious vista of the lake and mountains beyond, the broad blue Leman, with the verdant and woody Jura on this hand, and the great Alps in all their snowy magnificence on that. It has been often asked, was Calvin insensible to these glories? And it has been answered, he was, seeing he says not a word about them in his letters, no more to St. Paul in his, though his labors were accomplished amid scenes of classic fame and physical beauty. The general, in the heat of action, has no time to note the scenery that may lie around the battlefield. What to Calvin was Geneva but a battlefield? It was the center of a great conflict, which enlarged year after year till it came to be coextensive with Christendom, and every movement in which Calvin had to superintend and direct. The grandeur of the natural objects that surrounded him at times doubtless fixed his eye and tranquilized his soul, but with the alternations of hope and fear, sorrow and triumph, filling his mind as the battle around him flowed or ebbed, he may well be excused if he refused to sink the reformer in the painter. In being sent into exile, Calvin was, in fact, sent to school. Every day of his sojourn at Strasbourg his powers were maturing, and his vision enlarging. And when at last he returns to Geneva, he is seen to be fully armed for the great fight that awaits him there. The study of his character previous to his expatriation reveals these defects which, if not corrected, might have seriously marred his success. He yearned too strongly for sympathy, we do not say praise, with his work and his aims. His own delight in what was true and lofty was so intense that he reckoned too readily on finding the same in others, and was in the same proportion discouraged when he failed to find it. He must learn to do the work for the work's sake, irrespective altogether of censure or sympathy, save the sympathy of one, the master even. The first infirmity begat a second, a guilelessness bordering on simplicity. He thought that he had but to show himself actuated by upright and high aims in order to disarm opposition and conciliate friends and fellow laborers. He did not make sufficient allowance for the short-sightedness, the selfishness, the craft, and the cruelty that are in the heart of man. But the deep wound he received in the house of his friends helped to cure him of this weakness. He knew better than before what was in man. The sharpest injuries he saw were to come not from the Romanists, but from professed Protestants. He now stood armed on this side. But the greatest defect in the character of the Reformer grew out of one of his more notable excellence. We refer to the intensity and tenacity with which he laid hold on his object. He was apt to lead to the too exclusive concentration of his powers on the task or the spot that entangled him for the time. It tended, in short, to isolation. Up to his first coming to Geneva, he had lived only in French circles. The greater world of the Reformation he had not entered. And had he never made acquaintance with a wider sphere, there was a danger of his being only the man of Geneva, and giving to a little state what was meant for Christendom. He must go forth. He must tread German earth. He must breathe German air. He must survey from his post of observation the length and breadth of the great movement, at the center of which his own permanent place, and for 3 successive years must his eye be kept fixed on that whole wide field, until what is merely national or denominational has dropped out of view, or at least assumed its proportional importance, and only what is ecumenical and eternal remains. Here at Strasbourg he will associate not with scholars and burghers only, but with practical reformers, with princes, and with leading minds of various nationalities, and thus we find that when a second time he presents himself at the gates of Geneva, he is no longer the Frenchman simply. He is of no nation because of all nations. To the clear, sharp-cut, beautiful genius of France he now adds the robustness of the Teuton. He feels as deeply as ever the necessity of guarding the purity of the communion table, for it is the point of which he is to work outward for the regeneration of the Church in the first place, and the state in the second, and accordingly his aims are no longer bounded by the limits of Geneva. They stretch wide around, and the little city becomes the pedestal simply on which he places that spiritual apparatus by which he is to regenerate Christendom. Calvin, the stern, the severe, insensible alike to alpine grandeurs and to female loveliness, had married while at Strasbourg Idelette de Bure. The woman who had given her hand to the Reformer came from Liège, one of the earliest cities among the Netherlands which embraced the gospel. She was a widow. Her modest yet courageous deportment was evinced in facing the perils to which the profession of the gospel exposed her. Her devoted affections and deep-seated piety, as shown in ministering to the sick, and watching tenderly over the 2 children she had borne from her former husband, Jean Storter, had won the esteem of Calvin. Many friends from a distance testified their sympathy and joy by attending his nuptials. But why has not his Idelette de Bure by his side when he re-enters Geneva? She is to follow, and to be the modest, loving, and noble-minded companion of the Reformer during 9 of the most laborious and stormy years of his life. 3 horses, a carriage, and a sum of money are sent to her by the Senate to bring her to Geneva. A piece of cloth was presented to Calvin for a gown, and the pulpit in St. Peter's was prepared for the preacher. It was fixed against a massive pillar, and placed low that the speaker might be distinctly audible to all. Chapter 15. The Ecclesiastical Ordinances. Assembly in the Cathedral. Calvin's address. Resolves to stem the tide of moral ruin. Proposal to the Council. The Ecclesiastical Ordinances drafted. Voted by the people. his ecclesiastical government, 4 orders of ministers, 2 in reality, the Venerable Company, election of pastors, consistory, its functions, the council punishes in the last resort, the ecclesiastical ordinances, the laws of the state, freely accepted by the people. Is this the Inquisition over again? No. A theocratic republic established at Geneva. Bungener's defense of it. The first act done by Calvin and the Senate and people of Geneva was to bow themselves in humiliation before the eternal sovereign. Only a day or two after the Reformers' arrival, the great bell of Clemens rung out its deep, far-resounding peal over the city, lake, and campaign. The citizens flocked to the cathedral to hear again the voice that was dearer to them than ever. Calvin addressed them, dwelling briefly on those awful events which gave so deep a solemnity to the passing time. In the east, the Turk was overrunning Hungary and shedding Christian blood in torrents. Nearer to them, the pestilence was ravaging the cities of Germany and the towns of the Rhine. In France and England, their brethren were falling by the sword of the persecutor. In Barbary, whither he had gone to fight the Moors, the emperor's fleet and army were perishing by the tempests of the sea. The Reformer called on them to see in these mingled events the hand of God, punishing the nations in his anger. The sacrament was then dispensed, and the services of the day were closed with a solemn prayer in which the little city, environed on every side by powerful enemies, cast itself upon the arm of the Almighty. Without a moment's delay, Calvin set about his great task. Everywhere over the entire face of Christendom, moral ruin was at work. The feeble restraints of the Roman Church were dissolved. The power of the German Reformation was decaying, the political element having acquired the predominance. An outburst of pantheistic doctrines was about to drown Europe in a flood of hideous immoralities and frightful disorders. What was needed was a great moral power, strong enough to awe the atheism that was lifting its portentous head. This was the Herculean labor to which Calvin was called. He understood it. In his clear, calm judgment and constructive skill, in his powers of memory and of logic, in a genius equally fitted for speculation or for business, in his intellectual vision which extended wide, yet penetrated deep, in his indomitable patience, inflexible conscientiousness, and profound submission to the Bible, he was the one man of all then living who possessed the gifts necessary for the work. He would begin by regenerating Geneva, and from Geneva, as a center, there would go forth a regenerating influence over the face of Christendom. Accordingly, on his first appearance before the council, and before he had many hours within their walls, he demanded the erection of a court of morals, or ecclesiastical discipline. Immediately after I had offered my services to the Senate, says he, writing to Farel, I declared that a church could not hold together unless a settled government should be agreed on, such as is prescribed to us in the Word of God, and such as was in use in the ancient church. I requested that they would appoint certain of their number who might confer with us on the subject. 6 were then appointed. The Senate's consent, in fact, been given when it supplicated him to return, for it well knew that he could return not otherwise than as a reformer. Such dispatch did give Calvin and his colleagues use in this matter that the draft of the ecclesiastical discipline was presented to the council on the 28th of September. Its examination was begun and continued till the 27th of October. The project, as definitely amended, was on the 9th of November adopted by the Council of 200, and on the 20th by the Council General, or Assembly of the People. These ecclesiastical ordinances were farther remodeled, and the final vote of the people took place on the 2nd of January, 1542. It is, says Bungener, from that day that the Calvinistic Republic legally dates. We shall briefly consider this ecclesiastical order and government, the inner organization of the Reformation, the instrument for the regeneration, first of Geneva, next of Christendom. Calvin and the Council are seen working together in the framing of it. The Reformer holds that the state, guiding itself by the light of revelation, can and ought to make arrangements and laws conducive to the maintenance of the Church of God on the earth. He at the same time made what provision the circumstance permitted for the separate and independent working of the Church and the state, each within its own sphere. His plan of church order was borrowed avowedly from the New Testament. He instituted 4 orders of men for the instruction and government of the church: the pastor, the doctor, the presbyter or elder, and the deacon. We have here strictly viewed but 2 orders, the presbyter and the deacon, though we have 4 names. The presbyter embraces those who both preach and govern, as also those who govern but do not preach. By the deacon is meant the officer who administered the church's financial affairs. The city clergy, the professors of theology, and the rural pastors form the body known as the Venerable Company. The election of pastors was conducted in the following manner. When a pulpit fell vacant, the company united in a deputation to the council. In presence of the magistrates, the ministerial candidates were subjected to a severe examination, especially as regarded their ability to expound Holy Scripture. The magistrates then retired, and the company, by a majority of votes, elected one as pastor. The newly elected, if approved by the council, was announced to the congregation from the pulpit next Sunday, and the people were invited to send in their objections, if they had any, to the magistrates. The silence of the people confirmed the election, and 8 days afterwards the new minister was ordained as pastor, the moderator of the company presiding at the ceremony. The triple action of the government, the people, and the clergy in the election was a sufficient guarantee against intrigue and favor. The ecclesiastical authority was wielded by the consistory, or tribunal of morals. The consistory was composed of the ministers of the city and 12 laymen. These 12 laymen were elected by the Little Council, confirmed by the Great Council, and finally approved by the people, with whom remained the power of objecting to any or all of them if they saw cause. The consistory met every Thursday. It summoned before it those reported as guilty of immoralities. It admonished them, and unless they promised amendment, excommunicated them, that is, deposed them from the membership in the church, and in consequence thereof withheld from them the sacraments. The consistory had no power to compel attendance before it, and no power to inflict a civil punishment. It was, says Rouquet, a purely ecclesiastical chamber, possessing no civil jurisdiction whatever, which it left entirely to the magistrate. It gives notice to the council, and the council sees to it. In the infliction of its censures, it exercised a rigorous impartiality. It knew nothing of rank or friendship, punishing, says M. Gabarel, with equal severity the highest magistrate and the meanest burgess, the millionaire and the peasant. If the action of the consistory affected the reformation of the offender, he was immediately restored to his place in the church. If he remained incorrigible, the case came under the cognizance of the civil jurisdiction. The council summoned him to its bar and inflicted punishment. It might be imprisonment, or it might be banishment. The spiritual court looking at the act as an offense against the ecclesiastical ordinances, had visited it with a ecclesiastical censure. The council, looking at it as a breach of the civil laws, awarded against it a temporal punishment. We ask why this double character of the same act. Because in Geneva, the nation was the church, and the ecclesiastical ordinances were also the laws of the state. They had not only been enacted by the Senate, they had been twice solemnly and unanimously voted by the people. The people could not afterwards allege, says M. Gabarel, that they were deceived as to the bearing of the laws they were sanctioning. For several weeks they could meditate at leisure on the articles proposed. They knew the value of their decision, and when twice, on the 20th of November, 1541, and again on the 2nd of January, 1542, they came to the Cathedral of St. Peter's, and after each article raised their hand in acceptance of it, the vote was an affair of conscience between God and themselves, for no human power could impose such an engagement. They were 20,000 citizens, perfectly free and masters of their own town. The Genevese people were absolutely sovereign. They knew no other limit to their legislative power than their own will, and this people voted the ordinances from the first chapter to the last. They engaged to frequent public worship regularly, to bring up their children in the fear of the Lord, to renounce all debauchery, all immoral amusements, to maintain simplicity in their clothing, frugality and order in their dwellings. It is asked, is not this discipline the old regime of Rome over again? Do we not here see an ecclesiastical court investigating and passing sentence, and a civil tribunal coming in and carrying it out? Is not this what the Inquisition did? There are, however, essential differences between the two cases. At Rome, there was but one jurisdiction, the pontifical. At Geneva, there were two, the ecclesiastical and the civil. At Rome, simple opinions were punishable. At Geneva, overt acts only. At Rome, the code was imposed by authority. At Geneva, it was freely voted by the people. If it was the Inquisition, it was the people who set it up. But the main difference lies here. At Rome, the claim of infallibility put conscience, reason, and law out of court. At Geneva, the supreme authority was the Constitution, which had been approved and sanctioned by the free conscience of the people. What was established at Geneva was a theocratic republic. The circumstances made any other form of government hardly possible. The necessities of the city made it imperative that in its legislation the moral should predominate. Its very existence depended on this. But even the genius of Calvin could not find means, in so small a state, to give free expression to his views touching the distinction between things spiritual and things secular. Nor could he prevent the two jurisdictions at times overlapping and amalgamating. It is strange to us to see blasphemy, unchastity, and similar acts visited with imprisonment or with banishment. But we are to bear in mind that the citizens themselves had made the abstinence from these vices a condition of citizenship when they voted the Constitution. They were not only offenses against morality, they were breaches of the social compact which had been freely and unanimously formed. Those who, while the Constitution existed, and it could not exist a moment longer than the majority willed, claimed to be permitted these indulgences, were logically as well as legally incurring expatriation. Calvin made this very plain when, on one occasion, he advised the Libertines to withdraw and build a city for themselves. Such a city, verily, would have had neither a long nor a tranquil career. The more this legislation has been studied, remarks M. Bungener, the more it is seen to be in advance of all anterior systems of legislation. The form sometimes surprises us a little by its quaint simplicity, but the grandeur of the whole is not the less evident to those who seek it, and this was about to manifest itself in the history of the humble nation to whom this legislation was to give so glorious a place in the intellectual as well as in the religious world. Neither absorbing or degrading the state, continued M. Bungener, the Church maintained herself at its side, always free, so far as the Reformer had intended her to be so. This was indeed an important and indisposable element of her influence abroad. A church visibly in the power of the magistrates of so small a state would have been hearkened to by none. But the Church of Geneva had been put into possession of a free and living individuality. Henceforth, it mattered little whether she was a small or great, or whether she was at home under the shelter of a small or mighty state. She was the Church of Geneva, the heiress of Calvin. None in Europe, friend or foe, thought of asking more. Chapter 16. The New Geneva. The Ministry. The Weekly Exercise. Visiting. Calvin. His Sermons. Studies. Correspondence. From the center watches the whole field. Geneva, the dwelling of a righteous people. Calvin's aim to make it a model city. Character of Calvin's commentaries. Two Genevas. The Libertines. Geneva becomes the Thermopylae of Christendom. Thus we have surveyed only the grand outline, to see the completeness and efficiency with which Calvin elaborated and set in motion at Geneva for the invigoration of the Reformation. Let us glance a moment at the details. The first ministry was cared for, to guard against the entrance of unworthy and incompetent persons into its ranks. Candidates were subjected to repeated tests and examinations previous to ordination. The ministry was organized. Arrangements were made to secure its efficiency and purity. The pastors were to meet once a week in conference for mutual correction and improvement. Each in his turn was to expound a passage of Scripture in presence of the rest, who were to give their opinions of the doctrine delivered in their hearing. The young were to be kept under religious instruction until qualified by their knowledge and their age for coming to the communion table. Every Friday a sermon was to be preached in St. Peter's, which all the citizens were to attend. Once a year every family was to be visited by a minister and elder, and once every 3 years a presbytery visitation of all the parishes of the state was to take place. Care was also taken that the sick and the poor should be regularly visited, and the hospitals attended to. Never before, nor since, perhaps, has a community had the good fortune to be placed under so complete and thorough a system of moral and spiritual training. Calvin must first reform Geneva, if through Geneva he would reform Europe. It was a Herculean task to which the reformer had set himself. He could find no one to share it with him. Verret and Farel could not be spared from Lausanne and Neuchâtel, and it was on his shoulders alone that the burden rested. The labors which he assumed were enormous. In addition to his Sunday duties as pastor of the parish of St. Peter's, he preached every day of the alternate week. He delivered 3 theological lectures weekly. Every Thursday he presented in the consistory. Every Friday he gave a public exposition in St. Peter's. He took his turn with the other ministers in the visitation of the sick and other pastoral duties. When the plague was in Geneva, he offered himself for the service of the hospital, but the council, deeming his life indispensable to the state, would not hear of his shutting himself up with the pestilence. Day by day he pursued his studies without intermission. He awoke at 5 o'clock. His books were brought to him. Sitting up in bed, he dictated to a transcriber. When the hour came to mount the pulpit, he was invariably ready, and when he returned home, he resumed, after a short rest, his literary labors. Nor was this all. From every part of Christendom to which the Reformation had penetrated, from Poland, Austria, Germany, and Denmark, and from the near lands of Switzerland, France, and England, came letters daily to him. There were churches to be organized, theological questions to be solved, differences to be composed, and exigencies to be met. The reformer must maturely weigh all of these, and counsel the action to be taken in each, without diminishing his tale of daily work. He found time for this immense correspondence. Calvin had pitched his tent at the center of a great battle, and his eye ranged over the whole field. There was not a movement which he did not direct, or a champion for whose safety he did not care. If anywhere he saw a combatant on the point of being overborne, he hastened to his aid, and if he descried signs of faint-heartedness, he strove to stimulate afresh the courage of the desponding warrior, and induce him to resume the battle. The froward he moderated, the timid he emboldened, the unskilful he instructed, and the erring he called back. If it happened some champion from the Roman or from the pantheistic camp stepped forth to defy the armies of Protestantism, Calvin was ever ready to measure swords with him. The controversy commonly was short but decisive, and the Reformed Church usually, for some time after, had rest from all similar attacks. To those on their way to the stake, Calvin never failed to send greeting and consolation, and the martyrs in their turn waved their adieus to him from their scaffolds. The words, "We who are about to die salute thee," which greeted the emperor in the Roman circus, were again heard, cried by hundreds of voices, but in circumstances which gave them an ineffably greater sublimity. While he watched all that was passing at the remote boundary, he did not for one moment neglect the center. He knew that so vast a plane of operations must repose on a solid basis. Hence his incessant toil to reform the manners, enlarge the knowledge, and elevate the piety of Geneva. He would make it the dwelling of a righteous nation. All who might enter its gates should see, and those at a distance should hear, what that Christianity was which he was seeking to restore to the world, and what mighty and blessed transformations it was able to work on society. Its enemies branded it as heresy, and cursed it as the mother of all wickedness. Come, then, was in effect Calvin's reply, come and examine for yourselves this heresy at its headquarters. Mark the dens of profligacy and crime rooted out, the habits of idleness and beggary suppressed, the noise of blasphemy and riot extinguished. And with what have they been replaced? Contemplate those nurseries of art, those schools of letters, those workshops where industry plies its honest calling, those homes which are the abode of love, those men of learning rising up to adorn the state, and those patriots ready to defend it. Blessed heresy that yields such fruits! It was this, a great living proof of the gospel's transforming power, that Calvin had in view to create in all his labors, whether in his study or in his chair or in the pulpit. And in enlightening Geneva, he enlightened Christendom. In instructing his contemporaries, he taught, at the same time, the men that would follow after. Though his pen produced much, it sent forth nothing that was not fully ripened. His writing, though composed in answer to the sudden challenge of some adversary, or to meet an emergency that had unexpectedly arisen, or to fulfill the call of daily duty, bears traces neither of haste nor of immaturity. On the contrary, they are solid, terse, ever to the point, and so fraught with great principles, set forth with lucidity and beauty, that even at this day, after the lapse of 3 centuries, during which the works of numberless authors have sunk into oblivion, they are still widely read, and are acting powerfully on the mind of Christendom. As an expositor of Scripture, Calvin is still without rival. His commentaries embrace the whole of the Old and New Testaments, with the exception of the Apocalypse. But though the track is thus vast, which his mind and pen have traversed, what a flood of light has he contrived to shed throughout all! How penetrating, yet how simple, how finely exegetical, yet how thoroughly practical, how logical in thought, yet how little systematic in form are his interpretations of the holy oracles. Nor is the unction his commentary breathes its least excellence. Its spirit is that of the Bible itself. Its fragrance is of heaven, and the reader's soul is refreshed with the celestial air that he is inhaling. We now behold Calvin at his post, and we hang with intense interest upon the issue of his experiment. The question is not merely, shall he Protestantize Geneva, but shall he extricate the Reformation from its deadlock, restore it to its spiritual path, and, having developed it into new vigor and soundness in Geneva, plant it out in other countries? For 5 years all went smoothly. Nothing occurred to obstruct the regular working of the spiritual and intellectual machinery he had set in motion at this little but wisely selected territory. The fruits were appearing. By the blessing of God on the labors of Calvin, says Rouquat, the Church of Geneva put on a new face. But the Libertinism of Geneva had been scotched, not killed. In 1546 it again lifted up its head, and the struggle was renewed. There was in fact 2 Genevas. There was the religion and orderly Geneva, composed of the native disciples of the gospel, the foreign refugees of Protestantism, and the youth of various nationalities here training under Calvin to bear the banner of the Reformation in the face of fire and sword through all parts of Europe. And there was the infidel and the disorderly Geneva, a small but ominous band, the pioneers in their beliefs and in their practices of those bodies which afterward, at various intervals, filled popish Christendom with their swarms, and made themselves a terror by the physical and moral horrors that marked their career. One day in the large hall of the cloister behind the cathedral, Calvin was giving his lecture on divinity. Around this chair hundreds were thronging, and amongst them numbers of future preachers and of future martyrs. Suddenly they hear outside laughter, cries, and a great clamor. This proceeds from 15 to 20 libertines, who, out of hatred to Calvin, are giving a specimen of their manners and of what they call liberty. Such is the picture of the 2 Genevas. One of the 2 must necessarily perish. Among the libertines, however, there were 2 classes. There was the class of which we have just had a specimen, and there was a class of a much less malignant and dangerous kind. The latter was composed of the old families of Geneva. They loved to dance, to masquerade, to play. Hating the moral restraints which the new Constitution imposed upon them, they raised the cry that the ancient charters had been subverted, and that liberty was in danger. The other party joined in this cry, but under it they meditated far deeper designs than their confederates. Their aim was to root out the belief of a God, and so pull down all the fences of order, and dissolve all the obligations of morality. Both united against Calvin. In Wittenberg, the battle of Protestantism had been against Romanism. In Geneva, it was against Romanism and pantheism combined. Two hosts were now in arms, and their victory would have been equally fatal to Rome and to Geneva. In fact, what we behold at this crisis is an uprising of old paganism, its protean devices, the austere and the gay, and its multiform creeds, the superstitious and the pantheistic, are marshaled in a mighty army to overwhelm the gospel and devastate the kingdoms of Europe. Geneva must be the Thermopylae of Christendom. Chapter 17. Calvin's Battle with the Libertines. Pierre Amour, his wife, the spiritual libertines, a public confession. Jacques Gruet, an execution, practical reforms. Aimé Perrin, his ambition. François Favre, Madame Perrin imprisoned. Rage of the Favre family. The law triumphs. The disorders renewed. Calvin's appearance before the council. His magnanimity. Peace restored. Calvin meanwhile labors indefatigably. Growing renown of Geneva. The Favres again lift up the horn. Perrin made first syndic. Personal outrages on Calvin. Comparison between Luther and Calvin in their sufferings. Sublimity of Calvin. His wife, Idolette de Bure, dies. The battle lasted 9 years, and during all that time Calvin guided Geneva as a vessel on fire, which burns the captain's feet, and yet obeys him. It began in the following way. Pierre Amour was a maker of playing cards by trade and a member of the Council of 200. In 1546, his wife was cited before the consistory for several monstrous propositions. She had given herself up to the grossest immorality on principle. It is in this sense, she said, and in this she spoke the common sentiments of the spiritual libertines, we ought to take the communion of the saints, spoken of in the Apostolic Creed, for this communion can never be perfect till all things are common among the faithful, goods, houses, and body. From the consistory, Madame Amour passed to the council, which sent her to prison. Her husband, from whom she had learned these doctrines, saw himself condemned in his wife's condemnation. Besides, he had a grudge at Calvin, who had injured his trade by forbidding card-playing. One night, when merry at supper, he said to his friends that his religion was the true religion, whereas Calvin's religion was deceit and tyranny, and that the magistrates who supported him were traitors. On the words being reported to the council, Amour was compelled to apologies. Calvin deemed this a too lenient sentence for an offense that struck at the fundamental settlement of the state. He demanded the council should inflict a more adequate punishment, or put himself and the other ministers on their trial. The council, who were resolved to uphold the moral discipline, canceled their first sentence and pronounced a second and harder one. They adjudged Pierre Amour to walk through the streets bareheaded, carrying a lighted candle, and to make confession of his fault on his knees. The anger of the libertines was great. A few days after, knowing that Calvin was in the pulpit, they rushed into the church and made a disturbance. The council, feeling that with the gospel must fall the republic, set up a gibbet in the place St. Gervais. The hint was understood and respected. In the following year, 1547, events of greater consequence occurred. One day a paper was found affixed to the pulpit of St. Peter's, full of abuse of the ministers and threatening them with death. Suspicion fell on Jacques Gruet, who had been seen loitering about the cathedral. From a canon in the Roman Church, Gruet had passed to the ranks of the Libertines, whose principles his notorious profligacy did honor. The council arrested him. A domiciliary visit brought to light another trait of his character, which until then was unknown, save to his more intimate friends. His shorn head had not prevented him from becoming an infidel, and an infidel of very malignant type. Certain writings, his own composition, breathing an envenomed hatred of Christ, were discovered in his house. A clue, moreover, was there found to a correspondence tending to deliver up Geneva to the Duke. The billet affixed to the pulpit was forgotten in the graver discoveries to which it led. Gruet confessed his guilt, and was condemned and beheaded. The council maintained its ground in presence of the Libertines. So far from receding in the way of relaxing the moral code, it advanced in the path of practical reformation. It closed the taverns. It placed under surveillance certain places in the city where jovial parties were wont to assemble. It forbade the baptizing of infants by the names of popish saints, a practice which was understood to be a manifesto against the Protestant rule, and it prohibited the performance of the Acts of the Apostles, a comedy designed, its patrons alleged, for the edifying of the people, but which, in the opinion of the council, profaned the word of God and wasted the public money, which it were better to expend on the necessities of the poor Protestant refugees, which Geneva was now beginning to be filled. These decided measures only inflamed the rage of the Libertines. This party now found a leader of an unexpected quarter. We have already mentioned the name of Aimé Perrin. 6 years before, he had gone all the way to Strasbourg to prevail on Calvin to resume his place at Geneva. But he was not to remain always by the side of the reformer. Perrin was irascible in temper, frivolous in manners, a lover of feats and magnificent dress. He was and as ambitious of power as he was devoid of the talents for exercising it. He aped in Geneva the part of Caesar at Rome, but Calvin saw that his vein fitted him for the comic rather than the heroic, and styled him at times Caesar the comedian. He had been raised, by the voices of the people, to the chief military command in the Republic. He was thus not without the means of aiding his party and of damaging his opponents. The wife of Perrin was the daughter of Francois Favre, who was now closing a life that had been not unprofitable to the state, with an old age of shameless immorality. His flagrancies compelled the notice of the council. His daughter, Madame Perrin, gave a ball by way of showing how little she regarded either consistory or senate. This was a transgression of the ecclesiastical ordinances. All concerned in the affair, including one of the syndics, were summoned before the consistory. Only two, of whom Perrin was one, acknowledged their fault. The rest set the ecclesiastical court at open defiance, and, in accordance with the constitutional law and practice, were summoned before the council and ordered to prison. Madame Perrin was among the incarcerated. Her rage knew no bounds, and what added to it was the circumstance of her father being imprisoned about the same time for debauchery and adultery. The humiliation of the family of Favre was now complete, and their indignation was fierce in proportion. They loudly demanded the abolition of the ecclesiastical laws, and denounced Calvin as bringing back under another name, the tyranny of the Roman Church. The Captain General, Perrin, took the part of his wife and his father-in-law, and used all his influence, both in the council and in the city, against Calvin. The party increased in numbers and in audacity. They demanded that the council should strip the consistory of power to excommunicate and take it into its own hands. They hoped, no doubt, that in the hands of the council excommunication would remain a dead letter, and thus the mainspring of the Calvinistic discipline would be broken. Calvin saw how much was at stake, and resolved to continue the battle till he should fall at his post or be driven from it. With him it was no trial of strength between himself and the Favre family, which of the two had the greater influence in Geneva, and which should bow the head before the other. The question was to be decided as whether the Reformation, in its reinvigorated spiritual phase, should be propagated over Europe or be trampled underfoot by Genevan Libertinism. If it was to spread to other countries, its purity and vigor must be maintained at all hazards in Geneva, its center. It was from this calm elevation that Calvin surveyed the struggle. Writing to Pharaoh, he says, "I told them that so long as they were in Geneva, they should strive in vain to cast off obedience to the laws, for there were as many diadems in the house of the Favres as frenzied heads, that would be no barrier to the Lord being superior." As Calvin had foretold, so it happened. The law held its course. The Favres had to digest their humiliation as best they could. The law knew no distinction between them and the lowest citizen. The battle, however, was not ended. Nay, it grew still fiercer. Geneva became yet more divided and demoralized. On the 12th December, 1547, we find the pastors going to the Hotel de Ville to show that a great deal of insolence, debauchery, dissoluteness, and hatred was prevalent, to the ruin of the state. On the 16th of December, the Council of 200 met to discuss the measures to be taken. The contention was so hot, and the threats uttered against the pastors, especially against Calvin, were so violent, that their friends ran to beg the ministers not to appear that day before the council. Calvin proceeded to the Hotel de Ville alone. An excited crowd was gathered at the door of the council hall. "I cast myself," says Calvin, "into the thickest of the crowd. I was pulled to and fro by those who wished to save me from harm. But," he adds, "the people shrank from harming me as they would from the murder of a father." Passing through the crowd, Calvin entered the council chamber, where fresh combats awaited him. On the entrance, the cries grew louder, and swords were unsheathed. He advanced undismayed, stood in the midst of them, and looked round on the scowling faces and naked swords. All were silent. "I know," said Calvin, addressing the members of the council, "that I am the primary cause of these divisions and disturbances." The silence grew yet more profound, and the reformer proceeded. "If it is my life you desire, I am ready to die. If it is my banishment you wish, I shall exile myself. If you desire once more to save Geneva without the gospel, you can try." This challenge brought the council to their senses. It recalled the memory of the disorders that had made it necessary to implore the interposition of the very man they were now seeking to drive away, to save the Republic when on the brink of ruin. The recollection cooled the most irritated spirits present. A republic, of course, could bestow the title of king upon no one, but all felt that the man before them, though he had no crown, was in reality a king. He wore his pastor's cloak right royally, and looked more august than monarch in his robes of state. His magnanimity and wisdom procured him a submission that could not have been more instant or more profound, though he had carried a scepter and sword. Peace was established between the two parties, and Calvin, in prospect of the communion at the approaching Christmas, held out his hand to Perrin. The members of council, holding up their right hands, signified their desire that past feuds should be buried, and in token of conciliation, a banquet took place at the town hall.